Tiny Tim with us. Larry Strack. Sorry. I told him he's not going to get any sympathy from me with his crutches. I'm not falling for that. But no, it's good to have him here. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 13. And just kind of a review of what we covered last week. Romans 12 is one of my favorite chapters. I love it because it's such an extreme shift from what the rest of the book is. It's, you got all this lofty theology and a lot of stuff that we kind of struggle to wrap our brains around. But Paul isn't one of these guys that just talks about theology to talk about theology. That ultimately he's driving towards the practical, and here's how this should affect your life. And so that's what Romans chapter 12 is. It's about being transformed through the renewing of our minds, not being conformed to the world. And so he gives a lot of practical exhortations, starting with being transformed. And that's the goal of the Christian life. It's to be like God, not like this world. In other words, being a Christian should mean that we're different in a lot of ways, and we'll talk more about that tonight. But then a large portion of chapter 12 is just, again, practical ways to love one another, practical ways to love our Christian brothers and sisters. And it's as simple as using your gift. What are you good at? What do we contribute? What can we bring to the table in our local church body? The exhortation is use your gift, whatever it is. If it's teaching, use that. If you're a wealthy person and you're able to contribute with generosity. And you kind of had 7 different gifts that were there. But then also just, again, basic exhortations, just things as simple as being hospitable and rejoicing with those who rejoice and weeping with those who weep. So very kind of straightforward, easy to understand, hard to apply, right, on a consistent basis, but it's kind of given us the standard to apply to our lives. And then he goes so far, and again, he starts the section off by talking about let love be genuine in verse 9, right? And there's no greater test for the genuineness of our love than how we respond to our enemies and the people that hate us and the people that mistreat us. And so, the worldly standard is if somebody mistreats you, right, well then just take matters and you mistreat them back. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? That was even kind of the mindset of the Jewish culture in the first century, and yet Paul says, no, you don't do that. You bless those who persecute you, right? If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. And in other words, kind of the bottom line is we don't overcome evil with evil, right? Christians aren't ones to resort to violence and anger and vengeance. God's going to take care of the wrath. He says, leave room for the judgment or the wrath of God, right? In other words, for me to take those matters into my own hands, it's like growing up when you sat in your dad's chair, right? That's not my chair. That's Dad's chair. And it's the same thing when we take vengeance into our hands, when we are out there, pouring out our wrath on people. We are sitting in God's chair, a chair that is reserved for him. And that's not a position that any of us want to be in. So our job is to continue to do good no matter how it is that we're being treated. So chapter 13 is talking about, since we've talked about our relationship to one another, we've talked about how we're to kind of respond to our enemies in chapter 12. Chapter 13 says, here's your relationship to the government. And I'm going to be honest, there's certain passages that I would imagine this was the case in the first century. There's some things that when you heard a letter read out loud, some people were like, really? I got to do that? And like the foremost one that comes to mind is that if you were a servant and you had a master that wasn't a particularly good master, and Paul says, obey your masters, not just the just ones, but the unjust ones. I mean, how many people would be excited to hear that read for the first time, right? That'd be terrible. And maybe it's because I grew up in the United States of America, and America almost was built on like this rebellious spirit, right? Like, you can't tell us what to do. And so when I read Romans 13, I'm like, okay, I'm looking for as much wiggle room as I possibly can. And you'll know what I mean here when we read Romans 13. This is what Paul says as far as what our relationship is and how we are to kind of interact with the governing authorities. He says in verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. I came across an interesting quote by one John Stott, and these are a bunch of fancy words that I'm probably going to mispronounce. You guys know I'm pretty good at mispronouncing words. But I just found this to be interesting. He says, and he's talking about kind of the controversy subject of, okay, what is the relationship of the church with the state, right? And there's all sorts of argumentation and different angles and different ways to approach that. And so he kind of gives, and breaks it up into four main categories, four main approaches that you could take to this issue. He says relations between church and state have been notoriously controversial throughout the Christian centuries. To oversimplify, four main models have been tried. Erastianism, that is, the state controls the church. Theocracy, the church controls the state. Constantinianism, hopefully I pronounced that right, the compromise in which the state favors the church and the church accommodates to the state in order to retain its favorable status. And partnership, church and state recognize and encourage each other's distinct God-given responsibilities in a spirit of constructive collaboration. The fourth seems to accord best with Paul's teaching in Romans 13. I don't know that any of those are perfect, but when I look at this, first one that we look at, it's like, okay, I'm not on board with that one. The idea of, the church, the state controlling the church, right? That's, the state just telling the church what it needs to do. You need to fall in line. That's what happens under communism and Marxism, right? And listen, we're called to be faithful to God. The one that is initially most attractive to me is the idea of a theocracy, that the church controls the state. I mean, doesn't that sound nice? That it is, Christianity, it is the church that is controlling the government and making the decisions of what the laws are going to be and what the laws aren't going to be. What is maybe the problem with that? I mean, it's a nice thought, but somebody tell me what the problem is. Go ahead, Larry.
Churches can become corrupt. And back in the day, it was mostly people would get together and they would decide taxes, they had their own military,
Mm-hmm.
decide the government.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So churches can become corrupt. Anybody else have thoughts on that? Okay, that's true too. That ultimately we want to convert souls to heaven, and if we're running the state well, okay, great. But how many people are following Christ, right? Other thoughts on that? In a way, this has already kind of happened, right? What's a government that was ran by a church? Roman Catholicism, right? And the minute that we start, giving all this power, first of all, it's like, what church are we talking about? What vein of Christianity is going to be in charge of the state, right? And even if we agree initially with the vein of Christianity that's controlling the state, ultimately, who's in charge? Human beings. And human beings are, when they're in positions of power, are kind of prone to corruption, especially when you start factoring in money and taxes, and it's just rife with opportunities for corruption. So that one sounds good, but I think practically when we look throughout history, And when we really begin to kind of think about this, we can see how that caused huge problems. Go ahead, Amy. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, you can write laws that are moral, but as far as getting people to actually follow them, good luck with that. And so, I mean, obviously the closest one is partnership, but even that one isn't really, I don't know what to do with that, this idea of the church or the state encouraging the church in certain ways. I think practically speaking, our role as Christians is much more interpersonal than, okay, how are we going to change this? I mean, especially in our country, living in a democracy where people cast their vote, ultimately, how are you going to change the course of this country? Through interpersonal relationships, through converting people to Christ, and by, converting their values from a worldly system to a godly system, right? And so, anyways, I just thought that was kind of interesting. But any other comments or thoughts? We're going to keep talking about this, but yeah, go ahead, Larry. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk more about this because clearly there's limits. This is a bust of Nero, right? Paul writes this letter when Nero's in charge, and so I bring this up because Paul wasn't living in a time where the governing authorities, like, it was just hunky-dory and it was really great for Christians, right? Granted, Nero, I don't think it's quite as bad at the time when Paul writes this as, historically we remember him for being what he eventually becomes. But you better believe the guy was already corrupt. And Paul himself had already suffered for preaching the gospel, had been in prison, had been stoned, had suffered in many ways, by the abuse of people in these kind of governing authorities. And so before we go any further, I just want to plant that in our minds. That we want to say, well, yeah, but look at what we're dealing with today in our country. Okay, I can promise you that it was already worse for them under Roman rule than anything that we have experienced to this point. I mean, you're talking about people in government, the Caesars and emperors who had like their little boy lovers and things like that. I mean, that's how messed up this society was, and you can just imagine the corrupt decisions that flowed from that. And so, David, did you have your hand up? No, okay. Yeah, and so keep that in mind. Number one, the first thing he says, this is our obligation, is we are to be subject to the governing authorities. And the idea here is that we are expected to be submissive to the governing authorities. So, of course, we understand that. Our basic obligation, if the government is asking us to do something, we tend to do it. Obviously, we take the whole counsel of God. There are limitations to that. Well, let me put it another way. Does submission to authorities mean that we follow every single law and rule that they come up with or have come up with or could come up with? And how do we know that? What are some scriptures that give us more insight on that? It's kind of a classic one we tend to go to. Okay, there's a good one. That's another one that I wasn't thinking of. But yeah, Daniel, right? Other thoughts? Exactly. So Acts 5, 28 through 29, they were told clearly before, you need to stop preaching in the name of Jesus. And Peter and his buddies said, okay, I hear you. And then what did they go out and start doing? Preaching in the name of Jesus, right? And so they're brought back, and they're in trouble with, the local authorities on this. And Acts 5, 28 and 29 says, we strictly charged you not to teach in this name, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. So clearly Peter was not going to stop preaching. We understand this, that when government forbids something God commands, what's our duty? That's right. And when government commands us to do something God forbids, what's our duty? Yeah, our Christian duty is to rebel. But we see Peter doing that here. He is not obeying this law, this rule that they came up with and are trying to impose on him. But here's another follow-up question. Even though Peter is not following this rule that they gave him to follow, could we still say in some ways he's submissive? And if so, how? Okay. Okay, that was Paul, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. Go ahead. Yep, yep. So what could Peter have done when he's being questioned by the authorities that we'd say, okay, that's not being submissive? I mean, clearly there's a sense in which he's not submitting, but I think there's a sense in which he is submitting in the sense of his attitude, right? He could say, who are you to tell me what to do? He could stand completely opposed to these guys and question their authority, and to Alan's point, he could say, okay, we're going to organize a revolt. What these guys are commanding is absolute nonsense, and it's wrong, and he could lead a Christian charge against these people involved, whether it's got physical or whether it simply remained verbal, and yet actually what you see with Peter, while he says, we must obey God rather than men, how does the rest of that story play out? What happens to him and the apostles? They're thrown in jail, they're flogged, and they go on their way rejoicing that they were able to suffer for the name of Christ. They didn't fight any of that. And I think that's kind of what we're called to as Christians, that we follow what God says. And if the government wants to impose consequences on us for that, I think that we just willfully submit to those consequences. If they tell me not to preach Christ, guess what I'm going to do? Hopefully I'll preach Christ. And if they say, okay, we're going to throw you in jail for preaching Christ, what should I do? Keep preaching Christ, and then if they want to throw me in jail, okay, you can throw me in jail, right? Rather than running away, rather than kind of being a fugitive or something like this. But yeah, that's right. And so I think that that's one thing to consider. And so just practically speaking, there's times where we accidentally break the law. I think when we break the speed limit, right? And I think that we're expected to be submissive in the sense when we're pulled over, we're not being a jerk to the guy, right? We're not going off on him, even if it's a speed trap, even if we think it's unjust what's going on, hey officer, how's it going? That kind of a thing, and we pay the fine, right? Even if we don't feel it's particularly fair. And that is because in verse 2, any comments or thoughts on that? Again, that's not an easy idea, but I think that's what's being talked about here. I want you to notice in verse 2, I think we're given a reason for why we're to respond this way. And even in verse 1, the latter half of verse 1, he says, there's no authority except from God. Those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So how does this help us understand why it is we're to follow, the governing authorities? We're to submit to them in that sense. Yep. And again, that's hard to wrestle with, because how often do we have just perfectly great, good people in authority? How often throughout history has there been government that hasn't been involved in corruption on some level? People are still people. God can still have a purpose for even appointing a wicked person in the position of government, can't he? We already talked about an example of that earlier on in Romans with Pharaoh, that he raised Pharaoh up, and he had a plan of what he was going to do in and through Pharaoh. And so what this is saying is just a very basic point. Every authority that exists, did they get there without God allowing that to happen? No. God is behind every authority. And remember Jesus, when he was being put on trial, and he was standing with Pilate, and Pilate's floored that Jesus isn't speaking. He's not even offering a defense of himself. And again, Pilate is absolutely floored by this, and he's like, listen, do you not know, I'm the guy, I'm the boss, I'm the guy who can define or decide your fate, and is going to decide if your life ends today or if you get set free. And of course, what was Jesus' response to that? John 19:11, go ahead. You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. And so, even Pilate, he only had authority. Why? Do you think that was, by the way, when Jews read that passage, do you think that was hard for them to hear? That God gave authority to this Roman governor over his people? But that's exactly what Jesus is saying, that you have that authority from God. If God didn't want you to have it, then you wouldn't have it. So that whole idea of these authorities that God instituted, that's the idea of God arranged this. He appointed these people. And he says that whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. That idea of resist, again, is already kind of what we talked about. It's the idea of standing opposed to or setting yourself against, right? That you are actively in opposition and rebelling against the government, even in situations where, that's not what God is asking of us. And so he's saying, don't do that. And if you do that, what can we expect? Yeah, we're going to incur judgment. We're going to incur wrath because, God has set it up this way. And again, further explanation as to why that is, he says of, the ruling authorities, he is God's servant for your good. So a couple things. Look, this guy ultimately, he answers to God, and he's God's servant. He's God's slave. But what's surprising to me is he says he's God's servant for your good. And listen, we can complain all day long about current decisions that government is making, but are we better off with government and even the current government that we're under as opposed to no government at all? Which is better, no government at all or even the government that we have right now? What would happen if we had no government at all? The absolute chaos and anarchy. Believe it or not, while there's corruption, and yes, some of the wrong people end up in jail, and there's horror stories as far as that goes, way more often than not, the people that are experiencing the wrath of the government are people who have done wrong things, right? Who broke some sort of law that would even displease God. They stole, they murdered, something like that, breaking and entering. And the government is simply, carrying out that punishment against them. Now, we can find instances where the government is acting corruptly, but generally speaking, and we can find instances in history too, right, where a government just became totally corrupt. But generally speaking, government is there for our good. And if we want to experience that benefit, Paul says it's very simple. You just do what is good. And if you do what is good, by and large, you don't have to worry about the government, right? Again, there's exceptions to that, but by and large, isn't that true? If you and I just simply obey God, follow what he wants us to do, we love our neighbor, we bless our enemies, the government can only persecute that for so long, right? Before people say, wait a minute, what are these people actually guilty of, right? And so, and that's not even really something we're worrying about too much right now. And then finally, this is the one I like the least, right? That's all of us. He says, for this reason, you also pay taxes. And I think an objection that sometimes I hear to this is, well, look at what the government's spending their money on. And I mean, look at all these corrupt things. Now you got government-funded abortion clinics, totally wicked and evil. I'm right there with you on that. And even, they're talking about full-term abortion, these just heinous, crimes against humanity is really what I think it is if people are looking at it objectively. But was the Roman government involved in some fishy stuff, using taxpayer money for some fishy stuff? Who was it that carried out the crucifixion of Jesus? Who paid for that? It was the Roman government. So taxpayer money funded the crucifixion of Jesus. So even Peter, he is supporting the crucifixion of Jesus when he pays taxes to Rome. Peter, you shouldn't have paid taxes to Rome. No. We are not accountable for what the government does with money. I mean, they were also building temples and funding pagan worship and all the other heinous acts you can imagine that was involved in that pagan worship. We are not accountable for what the government does with our money. but we are expected to pay taxes. Again, that's probably my least favorite passage in the entire Bible, to be absolutely honest with you. But that's what it says. And I think there's a good reason for it. If we didn't pay our taxes, just using that one as an example, and you got arrested for it, what would people be calling you? What's the title that we give that person? What would you be known for? Tax evasion. In other words, you'd be known for something that really has nothing to do with our faith whatsoever. And furthermore, if we were evading taxes and Christians were doing this in mass, and the government begins locking us up, and people say, why are you locking up Christians? And they said, well, because none of these Christians are paying their taxes, people would go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? And Peter talks about this, that if you're going to suffer, Peter doesn't lie to us. He doesn't say, listen, if you're a Christian, you're just not going to suffer. Just do good, and you're never going to suffer. No, he says, the possibility that you will suffer. But if you suffer, how should you suffer? As a Christian, for doing good. Because when you are just simply doing good, you're blessing your enemies, you're even blessing the people that are arresting you, or in Jesus' case, he's blessing the people that just pinned him to the cross. People can only look at that for so long before they start asking questions. Why are you treating these people this way? It's not because they're not paying taxes. It's not because they're murdering anybody. They're not harming anybody. Because they go to church, they assemble, they sing praises together, they share this message that they believe in. That. So in that case, when you suffer at the hands of government, it becomes this magnificent opportunity for God to be glorified, as opposed to suffering for rebelling against the government or something like that. And so, go ahead, David. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and it was his own countrymen that were really persecuting him, ironically. So, yeah. So that's what I have to say about that. We're almost out of time. Let's go ahead and move on to 8 through 10. He says, owe no one anything. So he switches from this conversation about, we're not a type of people that are indebted to anybody for anything. That if we owe somebody something, whether it's taxes, whether it's respect, honor, give that to them, right? But then he says, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this work. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. It's almost like he describes love as this debt. Do we ever get done paying that debt? That's just one that we keep paying. Keep paying, keep paying. And I love, this idea, owe no one anything except to love one another. And, sometimes we'll say, when we're being mistreated, for example, I don't owe you anything. And I think that this passage kind of blows that idea out of the water. What do we owe to everyone at the very least? Love, right? That's what we owe everyone at the very least. And he says, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is the fulfilling of the law. What does that say about the relationship between love and the law? It's easy to read that and say, well, the law doesn't really matter, just love. But what is really this indicating about the relationship between love and the law? So, all the laws that Paul mentions, from 10 Commandments, they're all relational. I think that's what Paul primarily has in mind here. He says, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. What are all those things really urging us to do? They're stating it in a negative way, but what are they really urging us to do? What's the point of those laws? What do those laws help us do? to love others, right? And so while the law isn't the way that we're saved, I do think that we look at the relational law and how God tells us to treat people, and this is how we love people. And I think he's bringing this to the forefront of the Jews' mind in particular in that audience and saying, listen, you're focused on all these externals and the ritual, but your own word, the Ten Commandments, talk an awful lot about love. And I was thinking of an illustration to kind of help congeal this in our minds. But with marriage, for example, do we divorce our vows as far as that? They kind of set the parameter and the expectations of the marriage. Do we divorce love from our vows? Do we say, well, don't worry about the vows, just love your wife? Or do we say, just keep the vows, right? And don't worry about the love part. No, I mean, upholding those vows is how I love my wife. But I also love my wife, and if I do love my wife, I uphold those vows, right? And I think that whenever we're looking at either New Testament or Old Testament, these laws that are given that govern how we relate and treat other people, it was all about love. And we look at the law, and when God tells us to treat somebody a certain way, not to covet, not to commit adultery, I follow that, and that's how I love people. And I do it because I love people, if that makes sense. So we'll go ahead and wrap up there. We're out of time. But we'll go ahead and pick up in chapter 14 next week, and then we'll kind of sum up the rest of the book as Paul kind of gives his final farewell in the letter. But we'll have a lot to talk about with Romans 14. Any comments or questions as we wrap up? Go ahead, Amy.
I'm just going to say,
Yeah.
I feel like this is a really great passage to point out the fact that love isn't simply a feeling. Like
Yeah.
people think that it's a verb,
Yeah.
it's an action word,
Yeah.
it's something that we actively do.
Love does things, and there's certain things love does not do, right? So it's all about doing and not doing, right? Yeah, so good point. All right, thanks.